Welcome to today's class. Today, I will recap for you some of the issues that came up last week and also provide you with some additional examples to help you understand the content of that class. We'll also be building on that content, both in relation to last Wednesday's class by Professor Hirschbalin and also expanding on those topics with questions about meaning and the Newtonian paradigm, and then especially about the pattern we love to see in reality, namely the pattern of cause and effect. Most of the slides in this presentation have audio except for the content slides. Last week, we discussed a few passages from Jean-Paul Sartre's novel, Nausea. In those passages, the protagonist, Roquentin, had trouble relating to reality the way he was used to. You remember that he was sitting on a tram bench, and suddenly he realized that that word bench was arbitrary. He tried to put the word on the thing, but somehow it didn't stick. We call it a bench, but it could just as well be something else. Why this word? And as he puts it, the word refuses to leave his lips and put itself on the thing. He later has a similar experience when he sits in a park, and underneath his park bench there is a tree root digging into the ground. And he suddenly wonders about that word tree and the word root, and again realizes that these words are arbitrary. We put them on things, but the things themselves somehow appear indifferent to our attempt to put stuff on them, to put meaning on them. So he notices, first of all, that words don't stick to things anymore, and that existence shows itself, as he puts it, in its terrible, terrifying nakedness. Now, as somebody commented last week, of course, existence being indifferent is already an anthropomorphization. That is to say, we attribute human-like characteristics to the things that exist. But what Sartre is trying to show, or what Roquentin, the protagonist, is describing, is that existence doesn't care. Not because it could care, but it's just there. Things simply exist, and we happen to be in the world also, but there's nothing inherent in the things that makes them meaningful. The meaning we find in the world is exclusively the meaning we assign to it. This means that our grip on reality is more tenuous than we had thought. If words are entirely made up, right? If the things would exist without the words and our words are arbitrary, then our grip on reality suddenly isn't as firm as perhaps we thought it was. Meaning is not self-evident anymore, is a different way to put this. Last week, I mentioned that there are quite a few horror films or psychological thrillers that use this kind of concept as a way to get to you. A very famous example is Hitchcock's The Birds. You may have seen the movie. Here you can watch just a short clip, about 3 minutes. So go ahead over to YouTube, watch this clip, and then come back. Now please do the same for the opening scenes of Blue Velvet, a David Lynch film from 1986. In both scenes, we see a shift in reality somewhat similar to the one experienced by Roquentin on the tram and in the park when he's looking at the tree. We, of course, as viewers here are supposed to experience this shift, which is why I made you watch these clips. Now, people, of course, have different sensibilities, and one clip may appeal to you more than the other, or maybe neither of them appeal to you, but hopefully you see the point. Scenes that appear very normal at first, children singing in a school, people watering their lawn, suddenly take on a strange aspect. And especially because these scenes are so normal or so innocent, perhaps, that shift in reality is kind of fearful, or as we'll see in a moment, it induces angst or dread. The longer is no longer normal. Now, the beginning of any good horror film or psychological drama has an element of this, but as we said last week, there are of course real-life examples as well. When I asked the group about examples, several things came out. I myself mentioned the example of depression, of when you are depressed, meaning in reality seems to kind of seep out. Everything is in grayscale. Nothing has color anymore. Things that used to be meaningful, that used to be interesting, suddenly aren't anymore. And the question then is, has reality changed or have I? Or perhaps both. Perhaps I've discovered something about reality. Well, that something is of course exactly what Roquentin talks about in Nausea. The something he discovers is that all meaning is in a sense arbitrary and subjective. It's not in the things themselves. We have put it on there, and because we have put it on there, it can also slide off again. Other examples that we may turn to and that we may think of to understand this phenomenon are of course drug-induced experiences, when there also is a shift in reality and what appeared normal is suddenly very different or shows itself to us in a very different way. A much more positive experience, which can also cause a shift like that, is being in love. When you are in love, silly things, small details that perhaps you would never before have noticed, suddenly stand out to you in bright color. In a way, you could say that being in love is kind of the opposite of being depressed. Whereas in depression, meaning seeps out, being in love can imbue the world with meaning where you never saw it before. You also mentioned airports and spending time at airports and how you seem to be in a different kind of space, in a different kind of reality, where the normal categories don't exactly apply. Finally, and this of course is a timely example, I want to touch on disease. When you yourself are sick, or you know somebody who is very sick, suddenly life and the normal world around you changes. You don't take things for granted anymore. You constantly worry about things. And again, certain things that had meaning before don't, and other things suddenly take on tremendous meaning in the face of disease. There are, of course, many more examples we can think of here, but that's a little bit of an overview of what we talked about last week to just sort of jolt your memory. What happens in these type of experiences is that we no longer take things for granted, or we could say we can no longer take them for granted even though we would like to. We're forced into a different kind of mindset or into a different kind of perspective where the taken for granted simply isn't there anymore or has shifted. Of course, the coronavirus that causes us to have class online, for example, at the moment, could cause such a shift. Suddenly, things that you would take for granted, doorknobs, right? And the fact that other people have touched them, public gatherings, going to class, meeting with your grandparents who might be in the risk category, you name it. All these things take on different meanings because we see them through the lens of the guidelines that tell us to behave in certain ways because of the virus. As I explained to you last week, being afraid of the virus is a good example of fear. What is true in fear, so says Heidegger, who we talked about last week. In fear, we focus on a particular object or thing that we are afraid of. Right now, very concretely, this coronavirus. But because we are afraid of this virus, reality as a whole can shift. So even though there's a clear distinction between fear and angst, you do see how one could feed into the other. And this relates to a comment made by a student last week as well. Once we are afraid of the coronavirus, the whole of reality can take on a different aspect. We might be afraid to go to grocery stores. We look at people differently. Do they have the virus? Is somebody coughing? Things that normally wouldn't stand out in any particular way or you wouldn't notice at all suddenly become very noticeable. But to be clear about the conceptual distinction, whereas fear is of something specific, angst is more of a state of mind or a mood, better yet, because mind seems to imply intellect, whereas angst really has to do more with a mood, with a whole state of being. In angst, we are unsettled. It's like we suddenly aren't at home in the world anymore. because the taken for granted has slipped away. What we used to rely on has slipped away. So we live in, the English word usually used here is dread, angst, however you want to pronounce it, doesn't matter much. What matters is that you understand the distinction and see that angst is a general mindset, one corresponding to the time in the movie before the monster comes out, before we know what to be afraid of. We know that something is wrong, but we can't put our finger on what it is. In a way, therefore, terrible as it can be, fear can be a relief. Because when we are afraid, we at least have something we clearly can fear and that we can focus on, and therefore also try to fight or solve.